My name is Nadia. I am 34 years old. I spent 6 years married to a man who called himself a real estate developer. He had a leather portfolio he carried everywhere, to dinners, to meetings, to the kind of brunches where the conversation is mostly performance. Inside that portfolio were pitch decks, renderings of buildings that never broke ground, proposals for developments that existed only as PDFs. I am a senior financial analyst at a private equity firm on the 31st floor of a glass tower in Chicago. I review balance sheets for a living. I find the thing that doesn't belong. It took me 6 years to turn that skill on my own marriage. The night I finally did, it was 11 o'clock. I was at my desk. Marcus was asleep. I was reviewing a client's account when I noticed a $4,200 transfer from our joint household account I could not categorize.
I almost closed the tab.
I didn't. If you've ever trusted someone completely and then realized that trust was being used against you, this story is going to feel familiar in ways you might not expect. Hit like if you're already wondering where that $4,200 went. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'll be reading every single one. I met Marcus when I was 27. I'd just been promoted for the first time. I was still learning how to sit in a room full of men twice my age and not apologize for knowing more than they did. I was awkward with my own intelligence back then, carrying it like something that might make people uncomfortable if I set it down too hard. Marcus wasn't uncomfortable with it. That was the first thing I noticed.
He found it attractive, he said.
He liked that I was sharp. He'd lean across restaurant tables and ask me questions about markets, about valuation models, about how firms like mine actually worked, and he'd listen with this focused attention that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, genuinely seen. He had plans. That was the second thing. Marcus always had plans. A mixed-use development on the south side. A boutique hotel concept in the West Loop. A partnership he was close to finalizing that was going to change everything. He spoke about his work the way some people speak about a religion, with total, unexamined conviction. I believed him because he believed himself so completely. We got married 3 years later in a ceremony at a venue he chose, and I paid for. Our condo in River North, my down payment, his taste in furniture. The kitchen had a restaurant-grade stove that cost more than my first car. We never cooked on it. There was a home office that smelled like leather and cedar and a specific brand of cedar-scented candle Marcus ordered in bulk because it smelled, he said, like success. 6 years later, I had been promoted twice more. Marcus's firm still had a website. It had never had employees. He managed relationships, he told people. He was a connector. A visionary. He wasn't ready to scale yet because he was waiting for the right moment, the right partner, the right market conditions. There was always a reason, and the reasons were always sophisticated enough that questioning them felt small. I stopped questioning somewhere around year 3. Not because I stopped noticing. Because every time I asked, his answer made me feel like the problem. You're too analytical, Nadia. Not everything is a spreadsheet. You have to understand that real estate is about relationships, about timing. You wouldn't understand. Your world is just numbers. I am a woman who is trained to find what doesn't belong. I turned that skill off at home because it felt like a kindness. Looking back, I understand now that it was a mistake. Not a naive one. An exhausted one. There's a difference. The leather portfolio was a wedding gift from Marcus's mother, Diane. It was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are. Dark cognac leather, hand-stitched edges, his initials embossed near the clasp. Diane presented it to him at the rehearsal dinner with a small speech about his future, about how far he was going to go. She looked at me during that speech the way people look at a nice car parked in front of a house they're touring, acknowledging my presence without quite including me in it. I smiled. I was good at smiling. Marcus carried that portfolio everywhere after the wedding. It became part of his image, the serious professional, the man on the move. He'd set it on the table at the investor dinners he hosted twice a year, dinners I attended as a kind of ambient credential. I noticed in year 4 that the people at those dinners were always different. New faces, rotating cast. None of them ever became partners. None of the deals ever closed. I filed it away. I did not examine it. What I remember most from those years is a specific conversation that happened in year 2. We were in the kitchen. I was eating cereal because I'd worked until 9 and missed dinner, and Marcus was at the island with his laptop, that portfolio open beside him. "I've been thinking," he said, without looking up. "You should stop doing the pro bono work." I had just started consulting one afternoon a week for a housing nonprofit on the north side. It was unpaid. It was mine.
Why?
It makes you look unfocused. At your level, you need to be seen as someone who's all in. Pro bono work signals that you have extra time. You don't want that. I stood there with a bowl of cereal I'd already lost my appetite for, and I thought about pointing out that I'd been promoted twice without his career advice. Instead, I said, "I'll think about it." I stopped doing the pro bono work 3 weeks later. I told myself it was a timing issue, that I'd go back when things slowed down. They never slowed down. I never went back. That conversation came back to me months later with a clarity that felt almost physical. The $4,200 transfer had a timestamp, 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Marcus had told me he was at a dinner that Tuesday. A client dinner in the Loop. He'd come home around midnight, kiss my forehead while I was half asleep, and I'd registered the smell of expensive scotch and assumed the evening had gone well. I looked at the memo field. It said, shared expenses. We didn't have a category called shared expenses in our household account. We had rent, utilities, subscriptions, and a miscellaneous line I reviewed monthly. I had set up the account structure myself, 2 years into the marriage, because our finances had been disorganized, and I am someone who does not tolerate disorganized finances. There was no shared expenses category because I had never created one. I pulled 6 months of statements. I found 14 similar transfers, amounts ranging from $800 to over $6,000, all labeled with variations of the same vague language: shared costs, household miscellaneous, project float, all occurring in the evening or late at night. None of them matching any invoice, any bill, any vendor I could identify. The rhythm was familiar to me. I'd seen it in client accounts. The irregular intervals, the rotating labels, the amounts small enough to not trigger alerts but large enough to accumulate into something significant. It was the pattern of someone who understood, at least roughly, what they needed to avoid. I opened a spreadsheet. I am someone who does not panic when the numbers are bad. Panic is a luxury. You panic after you know the full scope. First you know the full scope. I pulled 12 months. Cross-referenced the transfer dates against my own calendar, my travel schedule, my late nights, the windows when Marcus would have known I was unavailable or preoccupied. A restaurant charge in Lincoln Park on a night I was in New York for a conference. A hotel receipt in Milwaukee. He'd called it a client retreat. He'd sent me a text that afternoon. Think this one's finally going to close. No deal ever closed. In 14 months, Marcus had transferred $31,000 from our joint account into a secondary account I had not known existed. I found the secondary account on a Thursday night while Marcus was watching television in the other room. I could hear the low murmur of it through the wall. I sat at my desk in the dark with my laptop screen the only light, and I stared at the account number until my vision blurred slightly. The account was not in Marcus's name alone. The second name was Simone. I didn't know who Simone was. Not yet. I closed the tab. I reopened it. I looked at the name again, as if looking at it more carefully might change what it said. It didn't. I opened the shared cloud drive Marcus and I had set up in year 1 for household documents, insurance files, the lease, appliance manuals. There was a folder called Vendor Contacts I had never opened because I assumed it contained exactly what it claimed to contain. It did not contain vendor contacts. It was a message thread. Long and unhurried and domestic in a way that made my jaw tighten. Not passionate. Not frantic. Comfortable. The kind of comfortable that takes years to build. I scrolled to a message from 8 months ago. She's in her own world with that job. She barely notices. I read that sentence 4 times. I'm not sure what I expected. Guilt, maybe. Something that acknowledged the weight of what was happening. Instead, there was this, a casual assessment of my obliviousness, offered to Simone the way you might offer a weather update. She barely notices. Like my trust was not a gift I had extended, but a character flaw that made things convenient. I did not close the laptop. I opened a new folder on my desktop, and I labeled it documentation. I started copying. I need to pause here for a moment because I want to ask you something genuinely. Have you ever caught yourself almost knowing something, almost letting yourself see what was right in front of you, and then choosing not to look? Because looking would make it real? I think most of us have. I think it happens more often in the places we feel safest. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you did when you finally looked. I read every response, and I promise you, you are not alone in this. I said nothing. That was the hardest part, not the discovery, but the stillness required after it. Living inside knowledge that Marcus didn't know I had. Watching him move through our apartment, set the portfolio on the kitchen island, call his mother on Sunday mornings with updates about deals I now understood were fiction. Watching him and feeling the strange cold clarity of someone who has finally looked directly at the thing they've been looking away from for years. 2 nights after I found the messages, Marcus hosted an investor dinner at a restaurant in the West Loop. A private room, 8 people, Marcus at the head of the table with the portfolio in front of him like a talisman. I sat beside him in a dress I'd bought 3 years ago and worn to 4 of these dinners. Marcus was brilliant that evening. He had a gift. I will not take that from him, for making a room feel like they were being invited into something rare. He talked about the South Side development, updated projections, compelling margins. I watched the faces around the table and I saw, in real time, what I had once been, people who wanted to believe because the alternative was less interesting. I smiled at the appropriate moments. I refilled my water glass. When one of the guests asked about my firm, Nadia, you're in private equity, right? What do you think of the market conditions Marcus is describing? I said something measured and non-committal that Marcus immediately built on, pivoting my answer toward his pitch without missing a beat. That was the role. Credible, quiet, present. The wife who worked in finance. Ambient legitimacy, ambient endorsement. I played it one last time. The next morning, while Marcus was in the shower, I called Priya Anand. She was a divorce attorney a colleague had mentioned once at lunch, 2 years ago, in passing. Unhurried was the word used. She doesn't perform empathy, she delivers results. I had 31 pages of documentation ready before I dialed. Tell me what you have, Priya said. I told her. There was a silence on her end that felt, for the first time in weeks, like respect. Don't move any money. Don't confront him. Don't change anything. Her voice was even almost clinical. I want to see the account records. I want the message thread. Can you get me clean screenshots? I already have them. Another pause.
Good, she said.
Let's begin. It took 3 more weeks. 3 weeks of ordinary evenings. Of dinners Marcus cooked twice because he occasionally cooked. Good meals, the kind that made it easy to forget. Of Sunday mornings with coffee and the Tribune, and a version of our life that looked, from the outside, completely intact. I used those 3 weeks well. Priya filed the paperwork on a Wednesday. The process server reached Marcus on a Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop in River North where he had a standing afternoon table near the window. He called me 4 times in 15 minutes. I let them go to voicemail.
He was home by 5.
I was in the kitchen when he came in. The papers were on the island. His portfolio was beside them. I'd placed it there deliberately. The leather had worn soft at the corners over 6 years. One of the brass rivets along the spine had gone slightly loose. I'd noticed that a year ago and never mentioned it. Marcus stood in the entryway and stared at the island. Then he looked at me. What is this? You've been served. I kept my voice level. My attorney filed this morning. He set his keys down. They clinked against the marble counter.
Nadia.
His voice dropped into the tone I'd spent 6 years responding to, measured, intimate, the voice of a man who knew how to make a room feel small. Whatever you think is happening here, we need to talk before. I've already talked. To Priya. To a judge's clerk. The financial records have been subpoenaed. I watched something move through his face. Not guilt. Marcus was too practiced for visible guilt. It was calculation. The split-second assessment of a man who needed to know how much I knew before he decided how to respond. You're overreacting. He moved into the kitchen, slowly, like someone trying not to startle an animal. Asterisk, I know things have been complicated, but this is extreme. Nadia, I am your husband. There's a joint account with your name and Simone's name. There are $31,000 in transfers from our household account over 14 months. There are messages. I let that sit for a moment. In the vendor contacts folder. He stopped moving. I watched the calculation happen again. Then his face shifted, not into remorse, but into something that looked like injury. The look of a man who had decided that offense was the better posture. You went through my private. It was a shared drive, Marcus. You put it in the household folder. You're doing this because you've always resented that I dream bigger than a spreadsheet. His voice had risen slightly. The portfolio was still on the counter between us. He hadn't touched it. You've never believed in what I was building. You've never really been a partner in this marriage. I funded this marriage. The words came out quiet, not angry, just precise. I made the down payment. I pay the mortgage. I have been making 80% of our household income for 6 years while you printed pitch decks for buildings that don't exist. And I funded a joint account with a woman named Simone without knowing she existed. I looked at him directly. That is what I'm responding to. The room was very still. Marcus picked up the portfolio. He held it at his side with both hands, and for a moment he looked, for the first time in 6 years, uncertain. Not small, he never looked small, but uncertain, like someone who had wandered to the edge of the stage and couldn't find the next mark. You're going to regret this, he said. I already regret 6 years of not looking closely enough. I turned back toward the counter. The contact information for my attorney is in the papers. All communication goes through her from here. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he picked up his keys and left. The portfolio went with him. It held nothing that could help him now. Here's what I need to ask you, because people always want to know what happened next, but I think the more interesting question is, what would you have done? If you found what I found, the account, the messages, the transfers, would you have confronted him that night? Or would you have done what I did? Waited, documented, prepared? Drop your answer in the comments. The responses to this question are always the most honest ones. What happened next surprised even me. Marcus's first move was his mother. Diane called me 48 hours after he left. She'd been crying. I could hear it underneath the precision of her delivery.
Nadia.
I don't know what's happened, but Marcus is destroyed. Whatever disagreement you're having, you owe it to this marriage to sit down and talk before lawyers get involved. I told her, calmly, that lawyers were already involved. I told her, also calmly, about the joint account, the transfers, the messages. There was a silence on her end that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. He told me you've been having problems, she said finally. He didn't mention. He wouldn't. She didn't call back after that. Marcus's second move surprised me more. He emailed Claudette, my direct supervisor at the firm. I found out on a Monday morning when Claudette's assistant appeared at my desk at 9 a.m. and told me Claudette wanted to see me when I had a moment. Claudette's office had a view of the lake. She kept it colder than the rest of the floor. She was sitting behind her desk when I came in, reading glasses on, and she looked at me for a moment before she spoke. I received an email this weekend. From your husband. She said husband with a careful neutrality that told me she'd already decided how she felt about the email. He expressed concern about your mental and emotional state. He suggested your judgment in client relationships might be compromised by personal stress. I felt heat move up through my chest. I breathed through it. May I tell you what's actually happening? That's why I asked you here. So I told her. Briefly, precisely, the way I would present a finding to a client. The account, the documentation, the attorney, the filing. Claudette listened without interrupting. She had a habit of cleaning her glasses slowly when she was absorbing something. She'd done it twice before I finished. His email is now in your HR file, she said when I stopped talking. In his name, not yours. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. I've watched you work here for 4 years, Nadia. I don't need a man's email to tell me who you are. She put the glasses back on.
Close the door on your way out.
I sat in the elevator going back down my floor and stared at the doors for 3 of the 31 floors. Claudette's words weren't warm. There was one more conversation. 3 weeks before the court date. Marcus called my cell at 7 in the morning on a Saturday. I almost didn't answer. I decided it was better to know than to wonder. I want to talk. His voice was different. Quieter. The performance had been stripped out of it, or most of it. Not through attorneys. Just us. We met at a diner near my mother's apartment where I'd been staying. A place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that came in mugs with small chips along the rim. Marcus arrived looking like someone who had stopped sleeping, which I noted was not the same as someone who had started feeling. He ordered coffee. He stirred it without drinking it.
I know I can't fix this, he said. No.
I'm not asking you to, he stopped. Start it again. I want you to know that none of it started as strategy. Simone and I, that was a long time ago. Before you. And I should have ended it completely. I didn't. That's on me. He looked at his coffee. But the money, that was wrong. I didn't mean for it to be. You transferred $31,000 into an account I didn't know existed, Marcus. It doesn't matter what you meant for it to be. He looked up. You're going to take everything. I'm going to take what's mine. I kept my voice even. The down payment is mine. The mortgage payments I've made above your contribution are mine. The money you transferred is mine. I picked at my coffee. The court is going to agree. He leaned back in the booth. The vinyl creaked under the shift of his weight. You always were better at this than me. There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not admiration, exactly. More like the acknowledgement of someone who has finally seen the board clearly and understands they've already lost. I turned it off for 6 years, I said. I shouldn't have. There was nothing left to say after that. We sat for another few minutes with cooling coffee between us. Then I left. He didn't follow me out. The ruling came on a gray Tuesday in February. Priya had presented the financial records with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. The secondary account. The transfers. The down payment documentation showing Marcus's contribution to the mortgage had never increased past 50% despite a verbal agreement made 4 years prior. Marcus's attorney tried for emotional abandonment, tried to paint the picture of a wife more committed to her career than her marriage. The judge reviewed the financials with an expression that gave nothing away. Marcus was ordered to repay $18,400 in documented misappropriated funds. I retained the condo. He received no portion of my retirement accounts, which he had originally claimed a share of. He didn't look at me when the ruling was read. He stared at the table in front of him the way people stare at things when they're trying to manage what their face is doing. I looked at Priya. She gave a small nod. We walked out of the courthouse into a February wind that was cold enough to sting. Priya shook my hand with a grip that was firm and brief and exactly as warm as it needed to be. 6 months later, I repainted the home office. I chose a color called sea glass, a muted blue-green that Marcus would have called too quiet. The leather chair that had smelled like cedar candles and borrowed ambition went to a consignment shop on Milwaukee Avenue. I replaced it with a reading chair I'd seen in a store window 2 years ago and never gone back for. I started cooking. Not seriously, not well, but actually using the kitchen. The restaurant-grade stove that had been a monument to Marcus's taste turned out to make excellent eggs. I called the nonprofit on the north side. The program coordinator remembered me. She sounded genuinely pleased. We've had a gap in our financial modeling support, she said. Would you be interested in coming back? I told her I'd be there Thursday. The leather portfolio, Marcus's. I'd last seen it going out the door the evening I served him. Wherever it was now, it held the same pitched decks it always had. Buildings that never existed. A version of a man he'd been performing for years. What I had instead was documentation. 31 pages of it. My name at the top. The truth in the margins. There's something I want to say about instinct. I am someone who is trained professionally, rigorously, to find the thing that doesn't belong. I look at numbers the way other people might look at faces, reading the small inconsistencies, the pattern breaks, the places where something wants to be hidden. I turned that skill off inside my marriage because I thought love required it. I thought trust meant choosing not to see. I thought if I applied the same scrutiny to Marcus that I applied to my clients, it would mean I didn't believe in him. What I understand now is that I was using the language of love to excuse a failure of self-respect. Trust and blindness are not the same thing. The people who love us, truly, honestly, do not need us to be blind. They do not benefit from our obliviousness. They are not made more secure by our willingness to leave things unexamined. Marcus called my inattention trust. He used it as a resource. The moment I looked was the moment everything changed. Not because looking broke anything that wasn't already broken, but because it let me see clearly, finally, what I was working with. And when you know what you're working with, you can decide what to do next. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone used your trust as a tool? Where your willingness to believe was the thing that made the harm possible? Leave a comment. Tell me your story if you're ready to. This channel exists because these stories matter, and because the people who carry them quietly deserve to feel less alone. If this story stayed with you, please share it. Subscribe if you haven't. And leave me a comment telling me the one thing you would have done differently. My name is Nadia. I am 34 years old. I looked, finally, at everything, and I did not look away.